Right, okay, the next exciting installment. Let me get this right. So yeah, a few things on the website that I just want to point to. So we have new slides, that's what's going on there. It'll probably be on Thursday, log normals and other disappointments. We have a position opening up for complex systems. So this is a good thing. You can tweet that to people you know and places that might be ready for that. There's a postdoc position opening up in computational creativity. That's between IBM and the University of Chicago. Just, you know, the fact that this kind of thing exists is mainly what I'm trying to tell you with that. You know, very exciting possibilities opening up in the world of science. All right, so there's that. There is some other things here. Oh yeah, this is good. So I told you that we have academic outputs. We have another one that just appeared last night. So that's a zip. It's about the zip thing. So Jake Williams is the lead author here. Also the lead author here. So these are fantastic bodies of work that have body of work of his that's come out of this course. And what else is here? I think that's good. Yeah, the video production, you asked. Right. That doesn't necessarily help you, but help me. Okay, so I guess to start with, I was going to talk about projects for a little bit. This set of slides is up. It may be in some health, I'm not sure. It may have changed a little bit, but let's see. So I just want to go through this quickly. There's a list of, so this is sitting online, and it points to a whole bunch of things. Let's see, so here's the idea. You're going to give a 3-minute talk. Well, I have to figure that out. It might be 3, 4, 5 minutes, but I'll figure it out. Hang on. Size. The team hasn't actually been too much, so we'll figure that out. Let's see, and then maybe something on the order of a 10-minute final presentation. Again, probably going to be in Japan at the end of the year, so there's going to be a complication there. We'll figure out how to do that. And then a report. In some cases, it will be a paper, right? You could be actually writing a paper. And others, that's not the case, but still, maybe set it out as a paper. I will give you a thing. I'll put a thing on GitHub. That's a paper format for some of you LaTeX geeks you might know.
When do you want to introduction to the project? Because the 5th week for classes is next week.
Yeah. So ignore that. What 5th is, not 5. Okay. All right. Yeah. So that's always the plan, but it falls apart. All right. So as I said, it could be a research piece. It could be something that's quite finished. Or it could be simply you're digging into something you want to understand that helps you in your field. Right? So there's a famous paper or paper recently that got a lot of press, whatever it is, something that seems to be important, seems to be about systems. I have this story of narrative hierarchy, so ultimately this is a good thing to be able to get to. I think I mentioned before. Graduate students tend to end up down here in the kind of saga situation. I've said this, I guess. So if you ask them what are they working on, it's very hard for them to kind of surface up here. Now, that's not a bad thing because you're sorting out, you're sorting out what you're doing. But this is really not just about marketing or something. This is knowledge, right? This is really about knowledge. And I know I've talked about this, but I think one thing to say here is advertising and the actual product. There's sort of a fracture that happens, and the advertisers are here, and the product is in another space. And they try to glue these two hierarchies together. Doesn't always work out. So we have here you can work on socio-info, algorithmo, econo, geotechnico, physical systems, and one large input that you can use there is a Twitter data set. So we have 10% of all tweets. We're now collecting actually all geotag tweets, which is about 1% of Twitter in a separate bucket. So there's a lot. There's just a ton of things here. You can find out what people, when they talk about food, obviously, but there are lots and lots of things. We do have a great project that's sort of coming to fruition now about, this is insane, right? We do this happiness measurement thing, which is pretty crazy, but we also have one where we're measuring caloric expenditure simply by, this is very silly, but by the food words that people tweet and phrases and the exercise type things that they tweet. So it's obviously fundamentally wrong in some sense, but it was just a crazy idea, and it turns out to work. So it correlates with obesity, for example, obesity rates. If you do it at the state level, you get a very good correlation with obesity rates. So you have calories in, calories out counted, right? So if someone says hamburger, we're going to turn that into whatever 100 grams of hamburger is in calories. Obviously, correct. It turns out to be really hard to actually get measurements for serving sizes. Right? So serving sizes are a thing. They're on the packets, but not on Apple, I guess. But they're on packets. So this contains so many servings, but no one really. They don't seem to work anymore. Your pasta plates in certain restaurants will be 10 servings of pasta, which is amazing. Anyway, so we have, that's just to say that food is actually kind of fun thing, because people talk about it all the time. Let's see, we have a sleepometer coming up. I think we'll get that, an insomniometer actually. And that seems to correlate with CDC measures of when people are sleep deprived. We have a hangover-ometer. These are based on different things. So yeah, North Dakota, Vermont, actually a little bit. All right, important things. But again, it correlates with binge drinking estimates from certain survey type approaches. All right, so there's that, and if you like the playing around with data, this is something you could talk to me about. I have this long-term play project, which is based out of what I call play. Humans play is sort of one of our big deals. Pretty much most things you list, it's like, yeah, but a platypus can do that, or squirrels are really good at that, or better than you. We're actually really good at throwing, I think, is kind of one of the things. We're good at running long distances. And talking about how different we are to animals. But anyway, so, okay, so you could, so this is the play, it's again, what a hunch and crunch, or play and crunch was sort of the original framing. Now we have hunch and crunch, so people are good with hunches and play, people are good with crunch, so you have this whole very interesting thing that's happening with people and computers solving problems that would be impossible for either one. I mean, so Google is a good example, actually, right? So Google is based on, originally, people making links between sites, and meaningful links. And then you have this algorithm. We tend to think of it as just this cold, hard algorithm, which it kind of is, linear algebra gone wild, but it's really people plus computers that made it work. So it's a socio-technical competition. So lots of things you could work on. But this is we've had online experiments. I'll talk to you, I'll discuss a couple of them as we go through the course. We have a whole list of papers, and I won't click on it yet, right now, but that we've gone through in that complex systems reading group. You just dive into those. We have years of these. Some more controversial, interesting things where they claim to solve everything about robustness of systems or whatever it is. I'm just going to give you a few random things. So this is a work again by Jonathan Harris. So he had the fun thing with. He's done a lot of amazing things. So he had the fun thing with words, right? The word frequency distribution Google Explorer, when people search for bad words. And he sneakily caught them. This is an old, actually it's an old idea of mine, and he kind of created something similar to this. And you can go back in the literature and find people sort of searching for this now in different ways. But how far away are places from each other? So there's this, it used to be very much that people traveling around, it's a two-dimensional space that we lived on. So if you wanted to, in a certain amount of time, if you were walking, right, let's say we're before horses, in a certain amount of time, you could, the amount of points that you get to grows like time, right, because it's radius. So you're living in the desert, whatever it is, and you travel. But when you have planes and trains and automobiles, right, you suddenly get to jump. And so Los Angeles isn't that far away from you. You've got to pay money, obviously, but Los Angeles isn't that far away from New York. The Tibetan Plateau, I think, is really a long way away. That's far. So, what's the actual kind of topology of the world? What's the, the state? What is that? What is that thing? So, anyway, that would be kind of a fun thing to play around with. There's culturomics. Had a huge splash a few years ago, published in Science. One of the authors is the Google Books team. So this is where Google very nicely bunched up a whole bunch of books, and a bunch of people from, well, I think Tinker's in this, I think. anyway, some researchers at Harvard. Generally, yeah, so this is mentions of simply the year. Right? So you're going through books, this is a function of year, so this is the year, I think it's 1883, 1910, 1950. This is just how much is mentioned on pages, right? So obviously the page 1880 will add to it, and there's all sorts of mess, but this is a suggestion of cultural memory, right? So that you talk about the present much more now, as time goes on, but it decays faster. So that there's a compression. So it's a nice story. This is really, we have a student working, this is very complicated in some ways because of the rise of scientific literature. It looks like they just jammed a ton of journals in there. And there's no shortage of journals. So scientific literature kind of has this structure as well. There's all sorts of things in here. So this is the hand-picked selection of famous characters, and this is when they became famous in their lifespan. So these are political figures, right? So it's in the 60s is when they talked about the most. Of course, there's a lag in books. Authors, let's see, authors are next. I know it's hard to read, authors are here. Biologists, no, that's actors actually. So actors are here, and then we get into the scientists. That's mathematicians at the bottom. Just a real dig, unnecessary, but a real dig. Anyway, there's a viewer as well, that engram viewer, you can play around with it. It's a little bit dangerous to view. We can say, oh, well, let's see if hope has disappeared. And people will publish this sort of thing all the time. Very nice little blog entry. Look, hope has gone down because it's going down. But you can't really do that, right? You have to do a full kind of rich search for things and see what's been replaced by it. And you have to understand, of course, too, if it's a rise in scientific literature. This is suppression in German literature of certain characters, right? So this is Picasso. This is a suppression index. Picasso is here, for example. So this is what they did essentially. So here's the Second World War in here. So this is how much in a given literature, English and German here, a particular character is talked about. So I think this is Herman. Oh, that's Matisse. So that's how much Matisse is being talked about in German literature. So it goes down. So they made a simple index out of this. Alright, so lots of, and then the paper was replete with these things. Alright. This has been a project that people have really, really progressed through. I think when I first started giving these lectures, there was just this first study, Brockman et al. It was a pretty fun study. I don't know if you know about the Where's George? Ever seen Where's George on the dollar bill?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where the money's been.
Yeah. I guess you get put in jail for doing that, right? The stamp, the people stamp Where's George or comment, right? And then you go to it and you put in the serial number and where you are. And so people would do that for fun. And anyway, it got picked up by this fellow Brockman, who's now back in Germany. He was at Northwestern for a long time. And they looked, because it's a nice it's a website, you can go and see which bills have had the most entries. And so these are bills that started in Seattle, and they were later found, down here. I guess this is Jacksonville. Some of this is in Georgia. Some of them ended up over here in Boston. And so you can trace them around, and you can measure it. So we talked about diffusion. You can whether it's subdiffusive, superdiffusive, how it behaves in time, how these things jump in time, how they jump in space. So it was a kind of a first effort to, in a big way, track how people move around. Of course, we're not actually connected to dollar bills in exactly that way, but it's very suggestive, right? And in fact, the title of that study was, the scaling rules of human travel. Okay, but it was really dollar bills. Another huge study came out later on, and this is about how people move around based on cell phone usage, and that's these pictures here. So it's much more detailed. It's still voronoi cells because you have the cell towers. So they're not pinning exactly where you are. NSA does that. So this is a funny thing about this is no one knows where this data is from, which is kind of a naughty thing in the sciences, but it turns out a cell phone company or a phone company in Europe just rang up and said, love your work, we'd love to give you some data, do whatever you want. And so that happened, and no one actually knows. Some people do. And all the time. Anyway, there's a lot of stuff that's been done with that. And now there's more work on migration, how people actually move place to place and commute. We can come to that as well. Lots of things, right? So this is controllability of complex networks, controversial piece, nature. So given you have a network, how many nodes you have to have control of before you can control the whole thing? Obviously you can use this for or evil, right? You go for the control the world bit, or maybe you just want your power grid not to explode. But a controversial piece. So this is the socio-technical computation I was talking about before, which was Google and so on. This was a thing that emerged, which was terrific. I mean, this might be just a fun thing to read about if you or go through if you feel like this might be applicable in your field. Oh yeah, Zooniverse. Zooniverse is here before. Let me mention this. So the idea, so protein folding is very hard, right? Very hard computationally. Of course, we do it all the time. We're totally happy with it. Biology is like fine. I don't care about your silly equations. I'm going to fold my little protein. So they do it all the time. But it's a bit hard for us to figure out how it's going to happen. So we of course throw it on our computers, and this was like the SETI game, the SETI Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, which we should look for terrestrial intelligence. But SETI is, the setup for that was to distribute these computation on people's computers. So if you wanted to join, you could join up with this thing, you still can't control the thing. And whenever your computer's not really running very hard, it will take over the computer and start trying to find ET. Do some compute some stuff about signals that have been coming. So that was sort of a big example. Of course, people just let that run. You don't do anything. So it's a citizen science type of activity for the greater good. This was set up in the same way. It's like, okay, say now we're gonna your computer. We have supercomputers, but it'd be kind of fun if you guys let it run on your machines, and you could watch it, right? So people could actually watch the thing struggling away trying to fold it. And enough people started to write in. Maybe it was, I'm not sure how many people sort of communicated this back to the researchers, who University of Washington, I think, and said, this is really annoying to watch. This thing is stupid, right? I mean, it gets some way, but then it's stuck. And obviously, if you just put that and a rabbit goes down the hole, whatever it is, right? It's obvious to people what a big step would be. And that's kind of the hunch, that stuff we can bring. We're not going to crunch a bazillion things in our heads. Computers are great for that. So it became a game. They made it into a game. And so you can put up your own algorithms, your kind of little games and so on, and people can merge them and play with them. And it does a much better job. So again, people plus computers. Zooniverse was kind of this very nice return. So now we're getting all this data through astronomy, right? So it used to be you look through the telescope and find a thing. I found a new planet. That's pretty good. That's the old school way of things, doing things. And that's still around, but in 2000 we started to get these massive amounts of data. Just unbelievable amounts of data, and that keeps going up. So Zooniverse is set up to, let's find Zooniverse, because it has more data. So you could look at pictures of galaxies, for example, and then you'd have to say, this is a spiral one, which you'd think maybe you could do with algorithms, but we're pretty good at it, right? We're really good with pictures. Let me see if we get that one going. Oh, so sad. You have hurt me. Yeah. Oh dear. You know what? I'll just finish talking about this, and then I'm going to read this. Okay. This is a paper that's controversial as well. So it should be about 8 liters. It looks like it's about 8 liters. It is. So there's a power grid there, but there's sort of a communications grid as well, or infrastructure, and it's about the interplay between those two networks. So your failure in the communication network may lead to failure in the power grid, vice versa. So it's very much a toy model, published in Nature, very much a toy model, but this interdependent network story, so this took a while to get going, but it's in the last 5 years people have looked at this a lot. It turns out networks that by themselves are robust, to certain kinds of dynamics, explode when they're coupled with other ones. So that's, and people have looked at that way back in the past, but now it seems to be a much bigger thing. Lots of other things. History, so this is, big history and psychohistory. A little bit of Asimov there. There's work on this, or attempts to understand, the trajectory of things. System robustness, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Are they universal pieces? So again, a Nature paper, this is 2009, so this is important if you're studying ecology or banks or whatever it is. Predicting such critical points for the rich is extremely difficult, and now they're claiming that there's a wide class of systems for which you can observe it. Sometimes it's to do with things oscillating before you can see. We'll get to this robust yet fragile story soon. Today, hopefully. Human disease and disease gene networks, right? So there's a thing. That's another study. This is Science, I think, 2007. Could be of interest. Controversial work, Fowler and Christakis claim that all these things spread socially, obesity, smoking, so stopping smoking, happiness, loneliness, so it's a lot of things, divorce, I think. It's based on the Framingham Heart Study, which was set up to study people's health long term. But there were a few questions sitting in there about your social network, essentially just that were set up for retainment purposes, right? So in 5 years' time, they want to find you, who's the person they aren't. So I think you could list a friend. You obviously put in your family because that was a big part of the health study. So that it's, in a sense, a very thin. So network subsampling is a horrible, horrible problem that most people have ignored. We've done some work on it, other people have. It's a hard, hard problem. But if you subsample the links or nodes, how much does that destroy your actual, the findings that you might attempt? So they're finding really just the strongest connection. Anyway, but this is a big deal. Books, all sorts of things. Subsimilarity of complex networks. That's Nature 2005. Strogatz liked it. You can imagine this is very much like fractals. This is something that's been done. Lots of other pieces. All right, this is all connected to that. You could look at patterns of cities. Let's look down on this now. Collective creativity, right? So Benford, Louis Benford said it was very nice work, or interesting work on how things scale with city size. So including crime, disease levels, so bad things seem to scale super linearly, but also so does innovation. Let's see, so networks and creativity. This is a long-term study of many years of Broadway musicals, actually. You can look at teams forming and dissolving, the creative teams. You can look at teams forming and dissolving when it comes to academic work, and so that's what this is based around, that little model for how teams coalesced and broke apart. There are a number of studies now that seem to suggest that the lone academic is not going to do it anymore until it's going to be about teams. Lots of things. So Yelp is their accounting for taste, called the its title. So we've tried to work on this actually. Zagat is the starting point, but they don't give the data away. Yelp is now releasing big data sets. Metacritic, there's also Rotten Tomatoes. Metacritic, it's been around for a long time, so now you have this tremendous database of in some cases, thousands of reviews by a reviewer. A movie that's been reviewed by many reviewers and many just average people writing in and seeing what they think. So that's it. You can look at the plots and so on. All right. Amazon's recommending this. So lots and lots of things. Yep. All right. So I'm just going to say these are some things to play around with. How does advertising work collectively? So these are just crazy ideas. All right. You may well have your own thing sorted out. I'm just going to blow this computer up because I'm mad at it. But it's kind of essentially an important thing for you to know. It's a tiny little set of slides. So Benford's law. Right. So if you take a pen, okay, so it's pens, but there are a lot of sort of natural data sets. This could be things like tax returns, for example. Well, you go through and you find all the numbers, or say the New York Times. You go through and find all the numbers. And you look at you count up how many times the first digit of the number, doesn't matter if it's a billion or 10 or 35. Right, so if you see a 35, you put one in your 3 box. Right, so we're just looking at the first digit, and this is a super weird thing to do. It turns out that this follows not for all data sets, but it follows this distribution in a loop. Right, so this is true apparently for tax returns, and people get caught because they're not good at faking their no one would ever expect this to be true. This is the first digit. So this is if you're in base B, so of course we're usually in base 10, but it turns out to work in any base. So that's true. Alright, so they have been kind of naturally occurring in some sense, and I'll give you some plots, but 30% of the first digits are typically 1. Pretty nuts, right? You'd think it should be because that's what you would do. And yet there's a law, there's a second digit law as well. The third digit is getting pretty flat, but there is actually a little bit of a tweak for the second one as well. So 9's only about 5% of the first digits of 9. So it's an old law. So it's first observed by Newcomb in 1881. Let's see, note on the frequency of use of the okay. And it was by looking through a book of logarithms. So you would never get, actually you wouldn't accidentally do this anymore because maybe you do it in some other way, but you wouldn't have this happen to you where you're looking at, you've got your big book of logarithm book over here, and you start leafing through it, or you go to the library and you see that the ones that, this is what happened, the pages that are most explored were the number 1, was the first digit. So they were kind of roughed up a little bit. It was discovered completely independently by a physicist, Benford, I think was an astrophysicist. People always say, well, Newcomb discovered, but it's called Benford's law. And so there's Stigler's law of eponymy. Let's get that one. This is an excellent law. So it was named by a professor, right, in 1980, published the paper, named after himself. No scientific discovery is named after its original discoverer. And so it was actually Merton. We talked about Merton earlier. Merton was the guy who he points to. Right? So to avoid this law about laws, so it obeys, it's also correct. Alright, so there are some other things, the Matthew effect, which we've talked about, so I mean, mentioned here. So you might want to explore that. Very enjoyable. An astute observation. Got a paper out there. Okay, so this happens a lot. Yeah, people get upset. But, So let's see, so fundamental constants, really nuts, right? You get the fundamental constants together, look at them first digits. Bills, tax returns, death rates, all sorts of street addresses, numbers in newspapers. So these are some examples. It's not true. Obviously, if you have a purely random set of numbers, it doesn't work, right? So here's an example. Actually, a student in this course, I guess, pointed out that it had been used to suggest that it was fraud in this election. Here are some examples then. This is from a particular paper, it's 1998. Numbers from newspapers. I'm not sure if it was the Wall Street Journal, I think it might have been. Just numbers from the census, the 1990 census. The Dow Jones. Right. So they have this thing, so huge abundance of ones. So the connection that I'll give you here is that it's to do with power. So these are the physical constants of the universe. Right, so how many are there? Right, we have a bunch of things that we just have to know the numbers of. Electron mass. I can't remember how many. What is it?
I'm not sure. I can get it out.
It's all made up. Population of countries. I mean, not bad. And this is really silly. It's a very, very strange thing. It's really silly. And you can say, well, I've explained how it was discovered, but it is kind of just a weird thing that you would never really think, oh, I wonder what the description is. You have to be kind of...
Yeah, 26.
I got 26. Good. That's the number I wanted. Yeah. Obviously, the alphabet. Numerology is fun. All right, so okay, so what's going on with this? So it's 1 plus 1 over d. So so log, of course, is a very flattens things out. So what's happening is it's log 2 in whatever base you're in, and then log of 1 plus third, and so it's right, plus a half, I should say, plus a third, and then 1 plus a 9. So it's gradually diminishing. So if you write it like this, though, this is simply d plus 1 over d, and we know how these log things work. So it's log of d plus 1 minus log of d. And I'll show you a picture on the next couple of slides. But this is the width, in your book of logarithms, right? This is the range over which the digit d appears. So what's happening is, if your numbers are somehow distributed uniformly in log space, and this is why the base doesn't matter, because log space doesn't care about it. So let's write this one down. So probability of log of x, so we're just going to think of the log of the quantity, d log of x, so this is the thing. So let's transform this, again, it's a variable transformation thing. So if this is 1, that's uniform, I mean it's proportional to 1, it's flat, over at least some range of values, then, and this is a d log x, so d log x is just, well, we can do d log x, it's 1 over x dx, right? The d, okay, I'm just going to write it down, is, differentiate this guy, dx, dx, d log x dx is 1 over x dx. So it's this, proportionality goes away. So there's a power law story there. So if this is actually p of x dx now. So if it's decaying like a 1 over x, somehow it's being manufactured by whatever's at work to produce these numbers. You know, fundamental constants of nature. You know, that's kind of up for grabs. You know, that's a good test for God, I suppose. Got it right. I mean, I don't know. Maybe every possible universe that works has this. You know, somewhat outside of our scope here. So, power law distributions, again, it's this extremely weird case of gamma is 1. It's still unnormalizable. And of course, there's going to be an upper limit and a lower limit here. So, here's an example you know, that's been produced by a couple of things. If you have a distribution that's like this, then these are the 1s, for example, and 1s again. These are the 9s. So, right, it's not really working. It's not an even thing. But if you have something that's flat over some orders of magnitude, so here's 10, 100, 1,000, then let's see, I don't think that's, this is numbers starting with 8, I guess. I think it is, yeah, it's separated. And these are the numbers starting with 1, so you can see the relative abundance of them, right? More 1s than 8. And you get this shrinking going on as you go through a log scale. So this seems to be a very real thing. And so there are different explanations. There's one general one which seems to be that if you're mixing numbers coming from different distributions, you can get this. But it seems somewhat, it seems breakable. It does seem breakable. But it's, again, something that has a fairly universal application. It's put people in jail, I guess. You know, trying to help you fake your randomness. What's going on? Benford's law is talked about in that same radio lab that I pointed out, which the first part of it was about logarithms, numbers, and then they have their fun little take on Benford's law. All right, so Benford's law was a nice little piece for it. But again, power laws, universality, and stringens. Okay. Computers rebooted. And we're live. All right. Okay. Oh, yeah. Well, we'll see if we have to do that. So system robustness. All right, so this is going to connect to what we've done before, power laws. We love the power law size distribution things. We have them, but they're around. So there's a natural connection there. The variable transformation thing will matter again. I mean, this is a very simple thing to do with probability, but that will be part of this as well. And we're going to have a fight between these two things, suck and hot, right? This is a ridiculous thing at the end, cold theory. But hot theory, and this is SOC, often just says suck. Self-organized criticality. So this is physicists using, making a fun term for themselves. It seems to be amazing, right? We were explaining everything. What's happened is the word critical has a nice, normal common sense feel to it, right? And then it's used in a very specific way in physics. And then when you go back and say, I found the self-organized criticality, you get all of the meaning of criticality coming back in as well. So it sounds pretty super cool. All right, anyway, hot theory, highly optimized tolerance. Okay, so many systems. Many systems have this. Just want to make sure this doesn't explode. So, right, lots of complex systems have this propensity to explode completely. Now, one of the biggest features, first of all, is that they persist. Right, that's good. Right, we have a power grid stays up. Human society generally keeps it together. Other things can happen, but it's lasted for a long time. But things can go very, very bad. Right, so we can have now, of course, because we've connected the power grid up, it's possible now we can have these catastrophic or large-scale blackouts, which could be catastrophic, depends how long they last for. Whereas civilization is 3 square miles away from anarchy, from complete disaster. Take the food away. food is very important. So when you have little children, you realize after a while, it's like, does anyone want a snack right now? You just realize you've kind of solved a great mystery.
Your entire day resolves around. Then you can
Just
get
have a snack. Let's go. Just get the levels up. And then you realize that that's true for you. Anyway, so then you've got it all solved. Food. All right, so disease outbreaks, obviously, you know, the fear about disease outbreaks also spreads terrifically, you know, which, you know, justifiably so. These are terrible. And we'll come to disease and spreading later on, because spreading is such a big deal in systems. We'll come to work on that later on. You know, the so-called Spanish flu killed an unbelievable fraction of the Earth's population. It's always, you know, named after the group that's just adjacent to where it came from. It's kind of bad. Wildfires, you know, big problem. And there are all sort of reasons for why these things are so bad. And now disease outbreaks, of course, because we have planes, you know, people fly and things can go bad. Wildfires, because in some parts of the world, we've suppressed wildfires, because that seems like a good thing to do. Let's not let the whole thing burn down. And then when it does, it goes berserk, because you've left lots of kindling around. Earthquakes, of course, you know, everything's okay, and then suddenly your baseball game kind of starts to wobble because that's what it is. I mean, very serious events. It's terrible things. It's terrible things. And the Earth is there and now it's shaking. You know, that's pretty bad. So obviously, this is, you know, all in the shadow of the fact that most of these systems are incredibly persistent and robust. They don't fall apart very often. So it's not so exciting. So the idea is then that maybe the fact that they're so robust is connected with this fragility. This Achilles heel kind of story. So Achilles is pretty good, but there was a problem with the dipping in the river thing. I don't know if double dipping was not on the other axis. I don't know what happened. Anyway, so maybe some funny stories up there. Let's see. So it may be, and of course it may be a catalyst. One. Let's go. Okay. So this is a good example of a robust yet fragile system. In that, yeah, obviously very robust, but then it has some rigidity. And we'll watch all of this because it's too much fun. There is, you know, absurdly, and this is true of so many of these stories, right? I mean, there is absurdly one way to just switch it all off, and then everything sort of stops. Whatever it is, Iron Man in the Avengers goes and blows up this other thing, sort of with a nuclear, and then all the bad guys just stop because it turns out they're centrally controlled.
lucky for us.
Lucky for us, lucky for the end of the movie. Because, you know, it could get messy if it turns into guerrilla warfare, whatever those things were. Alright, okay, let's have a little bit. Okay, we'll come back to that. Great. That's going to progress in various ways. So let's see. So here are a couple of reasons for why you could get to a system that's really pretty robust, but could go boom, alright? So evolution, like just kind of good, you know, humans aren't involved, well, they are, of course, in funny ways, but evolutionary processes can build these systems that, you know, they persist. You know, your platypuses, you know, make more platypuses. Yeah, if you get them, anyway, right, you can trick those guys. But engineering and design. So that is, now we come into play. Because we can certainly make things that work well locally, and the power grid remains this great example, right? Because always one of the great examples. Financial systems, another great example. You start hooking things up in funny ways, collateralized debt obligations, suddenly you've connected all these people, all these debts in some interesting ways, and said it's delicious. Which is very much in the way that you would with a hot dog. And maybe it is delicious, but you know, there are bad ingredients essentially, and the whole thing can fall apart. So engineering, yeah, and of course again, the power grid, lots of local systems that work well, but now you start connecting them for all sorts of reasons, and you have the potential for global disasters. So, you know, and of course we understand this when we started, we talk about firewalls, we know that we have to barricade things, so but there's profits to be made, and there's also just, you things are more, your system is more powerful if it's all connected, potentially. Finance is a good example, right? I mean, you can invest in a company that's on the other side of the world, and that's good. Value investment. Okay. So, the handle for this is highly optimized tolerance, right? And the idea is systems that have been optimized in some way. There are uncertain conditions, right? There are uncertain conditions, so you have to model that. You have to try and capture that in some way. There's some, and so our emblematic example will be forest fires, and so the uncertainty is lightning strikes. So it's not a uniform distribution of lightning strikes. It turns out that the top paddock, I use these words from my childhood, is more prone to lightning strike. So you don't put the sheep. All right. And so we have highly optimized tolerance, hot theory, robust yet fragile. You see this used. And Gene Carlson and John Doyle. Doyle is hilarious, and he, I think, had the hour record in a human-powered vehicle at some point. Someone in Berkeley put him in one of those eggs and told him to ride as hard as he could. And he did. Anyway, interesting guy. He's done a lot of different things. And he's worked a lot on trying to understand the internet. Because the internet, you think, oh, we have the internet, right? We just go out and kind of measure it, and now here's a picture of the internet. Very hard. So very hard. What is the real structure? Not the web, just the internet. So this is his first, actually, okay, so this is his first paper. This was his abstract of his first paper. It was, the title had a question, which would be. There's a pretty good one recently for the whole neutrino business. Neutrinos travel faster than light. Turns out they have the clocks wrong, but didn't, kind of mistake. But a little bit embarrassing because you're the guys who should be able to do that. But there was a piece that appeared in the archive that said, I think the title was "Can neutrinos travel faster than light?" and the abstract was probably not. I think it had content. Guaranteed margins for LQG regulators. A little specific. So he's a control theory guy. And the abstract was there aren't any. Okay, it's good reason. All right, so you can look him up. Gene Carlson is a physicist. She's done a lot of work in geophysics, I think, in earthquake work as well, as I understand it. And she's at Santa Barbara. Doyle's at healthcare. All right. Okay. Right. So these are some. I'll give you more features later on, but basically, these things perform very well. So you're making systems that work very well, in some sense, based on the context in which they live. They can handle volatility, badness, sort of things that sort of lightning is striking this forest, and a few trees can kind of get burnt up, but it's okay. Is sort of an example. But if things change a lot, the whole thing can blow to pieces, right? So if someone thinks he's in Vegas Canyon and knows all about that, whatever those things were, swamp rats, there you go. Then you're in trouble. Turns out that was just something you did not prepare for. Non-force, you used the force. Okay, so, and this is a really interesting part. So they're highly specialized low entropy configurations, right? So they're things that are really, so we'll see the contrasting view is kind of random ensembles of stuff that have this ability to explode. And of course we get power law distributions for the fabric size. Though I guess I don't know, at least in the narrative, right, with the Death Star, it's kind of tiny things with one big thing. So maybe that's a different story. Obviously it's a different story. Okay, so we're going to have a couple pieces we've seen. So we've had variable transformation, standard kind of thing, I know you're excited, and constraint optimization, which we've used in a couple of places. Right, so some constraint, trying to maximize something or minimize something. So those pieces will serve us well here. As we've kind of noticed, we can, if we have something that's a power law type, there's a power law relationship between two variables, it's an inverse one, then we can get from a nice, well-behaved distribution, whatever it is, Gaussian, exponential, something that has a good reason for being, to a power law size distribution. So, and the power law size distribution will be to do with how much the thing explodes. Right. So Pliplo, that's bad. Power law in, power law out. And this is a good thing. Mild in, wild out. That's the kind of story that this encompasses. And if we think about statistics, so X has a character, there's some characteristic size about X, whatever it is, but Y doesn't. things can happen. Okay, so let's do a forest. So I'm going to just explain this, and then we'll look at a picture of this. I don't want to build a simulation of this for 2 dimensions that I could play around with here, but I don't really have it yet. Your assignment will be to do a 1D version, which is much easier. I've mentioned this, right? As soon as you go from 1 to 2 to 3, 4, there are big jumps in the complexity. Yeah. And sometimes 4 dimensions is easy. Okay, so we're going to have an M by M grid. This is just a toy model. It's not how to build a forest. It's not how forests get built naturally. But if you're going to build a forest, this might be the way to do it. All right, so and it will help us compare to self-organized criticality later. So we're going to put a tree in each, so it's an M by M grid, and we're going to put a tree in, a nice big tree that would like to burn if it gets hit by lightning, or the tree next to it is burning, it's like a shrub, with density rho, right? So you can think about probability rho, so you flip a little coin and it has probability rho of saying tree, make tree, 1 minus rho, don't make a tree, and that gives you the density flow. So sites are simply then empty with this probability, and we're going to start fire. Okay, so it's a bit of pyromania. We're going to build this forest and we're going to burn it down. And we're going to build another one and we'll burn it down. No, we're just nature. It's like, okay, so we're going to start a fire at some point, and there'll be some distribution for the probability of that spark when you get, right? And it's going to be an uneven distribution. That's sort of the key thing. But not a really skewed distribution, right? It's just going to be uneven. It's going to be worse in one corner, say, than another. So nearest neighbor, right, just on the ladders, not corner ones. So it will spread. So if you have a little connected part of the forest and it gets hit anywhere in there, then boom, all of that goes. Right, so connected clusters of trees burn completely. So what you're worried about then is, what's the biggest size of, what's the biggest cluster size, and what's the probability of anything in that cluster getting hit. Right, so then you've got your potential damage, probability of damage occurring. I think maybe New York City is 3rd on the list in terms of expected damages. Right? Earthquakes are very, very unlikely, but it will be very, very bad. So you multiply those 2 numbers together, and you get a relatively big one. All right. So that's a good example of what if you're building this thing, you're going to kind of trade it off. You say, all right, there's really no chance or very low chance of something happening out here. So I'm going to put, I'm going to sort of allow for risk, not risk. I'm going to put more stuff out there that could burn. I'll connect more trees up. Right? Empty sites block the fire. So what we're going to do, so it's a 2-dimensional thing, and we're going to build fire breaks, which are 1-dimensional, and that's sort of the generalization that we have an n-dimensional or d-dimensional thing, space, and we build d-1 fire breaks inside. So we can imagine that in 1D, it's 0-dimensional breaks. So that if something starts here, it can only go to the edges. 2D makes good sense. 3D, the brain's not going to hurt. But it's like a little membrane around a particular region, so if something happens there, and then 4 dimensions. But basically that idea, and that's the idea. Keeps going.
So is this similar to the icing model of the game of life?
So it's going to be different to that. There'll be pieces later on that are more like that because they have much more randomness in them. Yeah. Game of life is another business. Ising model is got a lot of connections. But yeah, we'll talk about that later on. Percolation is this piece that's going to be connected in here. So don't destroy my computer, I might have to show you some of that. Alright, let's see. Okay, so here's the idea. We're going to put fire breaks in so that we want to maximize the number of trees we have left, given a random spot. Right? So could be bad, we lose all our trees because we put them all over there where we thought nothing would happen. And then we count that one, and then we put all the trees down again, and we throw another spark in, and we see how bad it is. And we do that a lot of times. So we'll see what happens. So it's what you expect to happen. So it could be really bad. And that's this story, right? So that's the story. Most of the time it's robust. Sometimes it can explode. And it's not quite the dichotomy of Death Star explodes completely, or someone has to put something out with a fire extinguisher, some small like lots of small things and some big things. So some systems like that too. Nothing really ever happens. Oh, all right. You just don't know Death Star. I mean, what could go wrong? Okay, so all right, we're gonna add more craziness. So we're sort of add a design element to this forest business, right? So we're gonna build a forest one tree at a time, which is a slow path. And, well, here's the design parameter. So we're going to add some sort of engineering. This is from the work of Doyle and Carlson. We're going to add an element of design to it. Very stylized, very, very stylized. So you have D ways of choosing where to put the next tree. Right? So for these three, you randomly try there and you test it. You sort of look at it and see how well that would work. And you get another random choice, and you try that. So you're not optimizing, right? You get another random choice, and then a third one, and you take the best of those three. So call it a design parameter. So if it's 1, then you just randomly choose it, right? Because you don't get anything to compare. You can't compare. So you're just plonking them down. So that shouldn't be very good. And so we have some underlying spark probability. Right? So what we do is we put a tree down, and then just let a bunch of sparks go off and kind of start it again, see what happens. How bad is this placement? So D equals 1 is random addition. You do all the testing, but you have nothing to compare it with. And if it's n squared, that means you test every one. You go to every place you put a tree in, run a bunch of tests, simulate lightning hitting it, and see what happens. Then you pull that tree out, and you put another one in the next square, and you keep going. So you get your very best choice. Again, averaged over this kind of probabilistic environment. Okay, so we're going to measure, this is using their language, so I can put their figures in. So there's going to be some fire size, C, that results, and it could be just one tree, right? If it's got a nice little, no trees next to it, then the forest, the fire size is 1. So that's going to happen early on, because you've got nothing in your space, and you put one tree down, let all these sparks go, and occasionally you'll hit that tree, just because you'll start. So the biggest size you can have is 1. Most of the time you get 0. So you'll be very happy with your first choice. And then the yield will be whatever the density was to start with minus the average forest fire size. So you're trying to maximize this, right? Or alternatively minimize that. But because rho is tunable, it's useful to put it in this way. Okay, so this is, for this particular example, I'll show you this is the setup. PIJ is separated into 2 pieces, right? So there's going to be I is go. I think if you go this way, which is wrong because it's matrices, but I think it's X and Y. Yeah, it's always bad. So there's a Y component, an X component, and the standard deviation. So it's kind of a Gaussian, right? It's got an offset here. Looks like it decays as a Gaussian. But if you look at it from 1, so if we have our forest, which we are maniacally going to torment, and you're putting like trees in here. So there's a distribution that looks something like this on this side, and like this on another side. And then you're multiplying these things together. So out here, there's a low probability of it occurring. So it's bad in this region. So to start with, you're going to stack up your trees out here. Right? And so on. Okay, does that sort of make sense? So it's uneven, of course, in the first place because you have some distribution this way, but it's also uneven x and y in terms of x and y. All right. So there's more width in the y direction. Correct. Okay. Yeah. All right. So let's try to understand this. Okay. So these are optimal configurations. These are the ones that brought about the highest yield when they used 4 different configurations. So 1 just means you're putting a tree randomly. You're testing it, but there's nothing else you can do with it. So you just put your tree down, you run your tests, and you get the average forest fire as a result. D equals 2, now you put 1 down, you get the average forest fire resulting from that randomly placed tree, you pull it back out, you put down another one randomly, test it as much as you can, and then you take the one that has the biggest yield. Right? It's better to put a tree here, so you say, okay, that's my new configuration. And you keep repeating it. D equals n means you're actually making a lot of, it's still a square root of the thing, but now you're putting down n trees. It's a pretty small thing. This is only, I think, 100. N equals 64. It's very tiny. It's like 980s. 8-bit actually. So d equals n squared. You're going to test them all. Right? So this is d equals 1, d equals 2, d equals n, and d equals n squared. So let's understand this business. So what's happened is, been adding them randomly, and you can see the random configuration. Right? So what's happening here is the trees are white and the spaces are black. So you're adding them, so you can see there's a lot of pore space here, or space between trees. All the black is the separation between trees. So this, maybe that's just blocked out because of that A. But if you land a tree, if you land a spark here, it's going to burn this, it's going to burn into here, it'll actually get through here, so it's not great, and so on. Right? But if you add another tree, here, that's going to open up this, and this will all be connected. That's bad. It does have this distribution of sparks, so the sparks are more likely here. They're more likely here than they are here as well, and less likely here. But you are not taking any of that into consideration because you're just randomly putting them down. So what happens is this gets close to what you were talking about before a little bit. This percolation, right? This gets to a point. If you add more trees, then this whole thing is going to be connected. It's close to that. So you add a few more trees to this, and then there'll be a path. I'll show you some examples. A path from one end, any tree in here to any other tree, roughly. Or there's going to be a giant component. There's going to be stuff that's blocked off. But there's going to be something that starts to be as big. The forest is going to be proportional in size to the whole piece here. Right? You light up this guy, and then you actually see trees on this side. This is why it's called percolation, because physicists are like academics that just look at their own thing, so they think about coffee. Actually, it was a good money maker because it was to do with oil. How do you get stuff out of the ground? But it's percolation. If I start some flow up here, it doesn't get from one end to the other. And if it does, then you know you've got a giant connected component. You've got a big forest. Even though it's still looking it's pretty fractal. It's fractal at that edge. Add more trees and it starts to fill up. Okay, d equals 2, you start to do much better. You get much better. I mean, you've added many more trees in here, right? The white space is much bigger here than it is here. This is the best, this configuration is the best yield. If you add more, your yield is going to go down. That's the story here, right? On average, your forest fires, you add one more, but you're hurting yourself. So on average, your forest fires will be bigger. Here, it got all this way and said, you can't add any more. Kind of gave up. I mean, this is a random process. It was d equals 2, so maybe you choose, you have to choose from, it should be done so that you choose from tree, the places that aren't filled. You could certainly add a couple more, you would think, but it's a bit of a mess. But what happens here now, though, is if you light this guy up, then all of this burns. So it is pretty dangerous, right? This does look pretty bad. Someone drops a cigarette here, it's all over, right? There's actually a block here and up to here. This is the most dangerous part, and this algorithm, at least, this design, managed to cordon that off. But all of anything that lands on a tree, anywhere out of that will burn this whole thing down. But again, it's its maximum yield, right? So any attempt to add more trees at this point, at least using this algorithm, yields a lower overall yield. D equals n, we've got a much more, so this is this low entropy story, right? This thing is very designed. It's clearly very designed. You think that it was an evolutionary kind of process, but it made something that reflects some underlying structure. In this case, it's the distribution of sparks. There are a couple sitting here. You probably put a tree here. Why shouldn't you put a tree here? But it gave up at this point. And then there's d equals n squared. So these two aren't terribly dissimilar, but And it isn't the best configuration, right? The best configuration is an insanely hard thing to figure out because you have to try every possible configuration. This is a greedy approach here. It's slowly sneaking up on forest. But huge, right? This is one big connected component, one big connected component here, and so on. And the dangerous ones are cordoned up. So this is where it's most likely to get a spark, and we'll just burn that little piece. And again, these guys, so it relaxes a little bit. Okay, you get a spark here, you burn more trees, but there's less likelihood of getting that spark. Same with this, there's less likelihood, and then even less likelihood for landing up here. Even though you've got many more targets, when you add the whole thing up, you're balancing the load. Alright, so, these forests do well on average. They tend to look okay. This thing is being attacked here over and over, generally speaking. That's fine. And then kaboosh. And but it was all fine. So you get these rare and they're extreme events. But you also do get these events that are pretty bad in between. So it's capturing, we do have this, so we're talking about this, the 100-year flood, 1,000-year flood, that sort of thing, which we get wrong because we say it happens over 2 years. But it's capturing that story. So we've got robustness and fragility of that. So this can be generalized in a lot of ways. So this connects to the previous image, so keep that in your head. I think it's, this is for the random allocation one, right? So this is the density. So you're adding more and more trees. This is when you fill the whole thing up. This is the yield. So you're adding more trees to start with. And even when you're up to 50% of the trees, it's pretty good, right? These trees aren't very connected. You get a random fire, fine, but it doesn't burn much. It doesn't, on average, burn much. It burns a few trees. And then once you go past this threshold here, and now out here is really bad. You've added maybe 70% of your trees, so that's how many trees you start with, right? So there's a linear piece here. This is the starting fraction, and that's how many get burnt on average. Right, so your yield is what's left. So that's that, right? So that configuration, this configuration, it's that point. You can keep adding it, but you're in a lot of trouble. It's bad. So this is n equals 2, and d equals 2, and d equals n and n squared are here. So d equals 2, it was still messy. It doesn't have the structure of these things at all. But it turns out you get to about almost 90% of the trees have been planted or put in, and you start to see, well, this is a bad situation. And it actually starts to be worse to add more. And then n and n squared are really not different, at least for this little development, right? So obviously computationally it's much harder to explore n squared versus n. And this is a small setup. Should do it. 64 by 64 is not much. Okay. One better guy. That's good. So there are a couple of things that happen. One is there's no design in this thing, and it leaves you with a random structure, which performs poorly. There's a lot of design, even just a marginal amount of design, d equals 2, leaves you with something that's not random looking. And if you increase the design even more, you get something certainly that's very structured. Right? Both of these are very structured looking things. So the low entropy structures, they're highly optimized, they're mostly tolerant. And they're tolerant that most of the time that happens, but they're fragile. So it's a good story. This is a good story. These are pretty messy looking things. Here's event size. See, this is supposed to be kind of a parallel of sorts. D equals 1 is horrible. That's this guy. But the idea is that you still get parallel size distributions. What's that last one? Yeah. So this is the really designed system, d equals n squared. These are density going from rho equals 0.1 to rho equals 0.9. So 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And the claim is here, it's not a lot of, it's not a very big system, but there are parallel size distributions. Right? You're designing this thing, here's the right picture. You're designing this thing, you're saying, okay, here's my density, 0.1. The really designed system has a parallel size distribution for its failures, even when you only have 10% of the trees. It's the claim. All the way up to here, and of course, at the end, once you've added everything, then the other result you get is everything every time. But so this adds a piece that we don't see in other models, which is there's not a critical point. Right? There's not one sort of specially tuned kind of construction of the system. The system could be designed to different degrees and or evolve to different degrees. I guess the design process is not finished, and you still get parallel size distribution. That is the claim of this thing here. We really should run this on n equals 10,000. That would be good. So that's it. So that's a big deal. Right? A lot of systems also, as I said, have these very specific points that somehow magically have to be reached or achieved. Self-organized criticality is that story. Oh, okay, let's have a couple of minutes and maybe that's where we should stop today. There's also the sun. Squirrels. Yes. So it has to be one away, right? Because we wouldn't have that story. So the narrative goes out. So if the odds are one in a million, then the hero always succeeds. That's guaranteed. It's guaranteed. It's guaranteed. Absolutely. 10,000 to 1. But yeah. So we'll come back to more of this different kind of flavor. And we'll talk about self-organized criticality on Thursday and maybe some of this local normality madness. Then we're through a lot of good stuff. We can leave the parallels alone for a little while. A little bit, sort of. And we'll talk about networks. That's another big thing. Parallels will always be there. Don't worry. All right. Thank you. Thank you.